It's my pleasure and honor to be here this morning for you, late at night for me. Uh, Even if it has to be online, my this evening. I've had a long and very pleasant relationship with the students and the faculty and the staff at the law school at Masaryk University, and I really hope to continue that relationship. It's been tremendously gratifying for me. And I really hope to continue that. Above all, to see you in person, real live in person. Today, this morning for you, I'm going to add to what I have taught in my mini course on racism and the law in a couple of times before at Masaryk. And as you all know, last year, a series of brutal killings occurred in the United States against Black Americans, especially the ones that you know that have been, I think, so highly publicized. Uh, Ahmaud Arbery in Georgia, Breonna Taylor in Kentucky, and most horrible of all, George Floyd in Minnesota. Floyd was choked to death by police officer Derek Chauvin, who actually goes on trial in Minneapolis, Minnesota this week. Jury selection begins today. The murder, as you know, was captured on video and was shown throughout the world. I'm sure that the vast majority of you have seen it. Over 9 minutes of that police officer with his knee on George Floyd's neck. And before George Floyd died, he said, "I can't breathe." Absolutely horrible, absolutely heartbreaking to watch that. Almost immediately after that video became available throughout the United States, and almost immediately thereafter throughout the world, mass protests began in Minneapolis, Minnesota. One of my UCLA students, an African American young man, was so engaged, so incensed at what happened that he immediately flew, even though it was a pandemic. And he got on an airplane and he flew to Minneapolis. And I'm going to be interviewing him. He's been my student, several of my classes. But Minneapolis was the beginning. This occurred all over the United States, and there were protests really throughout the world. I know that there were protests in Prague. I know that in neighboring Slovakia, there were also protests in Bratislava. I know that there were protests in Berlin, in Paris, in London, and really throughout Europe and much of the rest of the world. In the United States, the protests were huge. And I have to tell you that I participated in many of the very large protests in Los Angeles. I took part in them because I have a long personal record, as Michelle mentioned a moment or two ago. I have a long personal record of activism. Goes back a long time. I care a lot about civil rights. It's extraordinarily important to me. And so there was no way that I would miss out on those protests, even though there was a pandemic, and even though at my age, although I have no particular underlying medical conditions, my age put me at slightly higher risk for the pandemic. It didn't matter to me. I felt absolutely engaged by what was happening, and I felt that I absolutely had to go on the streets. And I went, by my count, on at least 8 of those. They were all non-violent. I didn't personally see any acts of violence by the protesters themselves. I know that there were a few, and some of the burnings and some of the lootings, in my experience, they were largely done by professional criminals and had, from my experience, nothing to do with the actual protesters themselves. On the other hand, I did see violence, but that violence was done by the police themselves. So it was a one-way street. And it was not done by the protesters, but by the police. That was my actual experience. Also, I can tell you, I was part of the legal team. I served as a lawyer for many of the thousands of people in Los Angeles who were arrested for various charges like curfew violation. And I was part of a very large legal team. And we were very successful in having the criminal charges, minor charges, that were dismissed. And in some cases, when I served as a legal observer, I actually intervened with the police, and I got them to hold off, keeping them from actually making the arrest. I have a lot of personal experience in intervening with the police. I'm, I think, fairly effective in being able to converse with police officers in a relatively firm but friendly way, and trying to explain to them that it would not be a good idea to make mass arrests. And I was actually very successful in that in a number of cases. So I feel very good about doing that. I have spent my entire life as a lawyer doing social justice work, pro bono work. I never make any money as a lawyer. I've made my entire living as a University of California teacher. I pay my legal fees every year, and as I said, I only do pro bono work. And I'm perfectly happy with that arrangement. So let's look at some of the legal developments that have occurred since that all of those protests happened. I should explain, I think, that those protests were among the largest and most important, in my view, since the major civil rights demonstrations from the 1960s and the 1970s. They were bigger, more extensive than anything I have seen for almost 50 years. And I think that for the first time in a long time, the political leaders, both nationally, at the state level and at the local level in the United States, finally had to take steps to respond to what was going on. There were significant legal developments, and when I'm going to be teaching my class in a few weeks on racism and the law, I've fundamentally revised my syllabus in order to take some of those developments into account. These legal developments they're multifaceted, and I'm going to try to explain some of them briefly because they're very detailed, and I only have a little bit of time, but I'll try to give them as much. I'll try to give you as much detail as I possibly can within the time framework that I have this morning for you. The most important thing that occurred, and it has the force of law, occurred the operation of American policing, because that was the major focus of all of these demonstrations. One of the big slogans, and I saw this really so many times when I was on the streets with these signs. There were lots of signs. Many signs that said, say their names. And one of the slogans that we said on the streets was Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and above all, George Floyd. But one of the posters that we saw constantly was defund the police. Now, let me be very politically realistic about that. Nobody in the United States is going to defund the police. That's a nice slogan, defund the police, but it's not actually going to happen. Public opinion is just simply not going to allow that to happen. As nice as that may sound, There will continue, in my judgment, to be police forces throughout the United States for a lot of reasons. Public opinion demands it. We still have criminals in the United States, even beyond what's been happening on the civil rights front. We still have serious crime. We still have robbers. We still have rapists. We still have murderers. And we need to have some kind of an organized force that will apprehend them. So we need major reforms in police departments, but it's absolutely utopian, totally unrealistic to imagine that police departments are just going to disappear. So that's not going to happen. There's one additional reason why that won't happen. Police unions are enormously strong. I believe they're far stronger than they should be. I am a long-time union member. I've been a member of the American Federation of Teachers. I'm a member of the teachers union, and so I'm a strong supporter of the union movement, but I'm not particularly happy about the police unions. But they are very strong, and they would never, ever allow police departments to disappear. That's simply not going to happen. But having said that, I can say this as well. The protests have brought very, very serious changes already to police forces throughout the United States, especially in large cities. And these changes have the force of law. That's, I think, important, that the changes that have already been made have been legal changes. They have had legislative changes done by city councils. I live in Los Angeles, and we've already had actions by the Los Angeles City Council. We have a county board of supervisors, and they've already taken actions. We have a lot of other municipalities in the Los Angeles area with local police departments, and many of them have taken actions. And so all of those actions are local legal actions, but they are legal developments. And so those are things that need to be addressed. And that's going to be part of what I'm going to be dealing with in much greater detail than I can possibly do this morning for you. But let me tell you some of the details that I've been able to observe. Some of the protests brought serious changes that I want to discuss. The first of which is the fundamental reduction in police budgets. And those have been, I think, very significant. Let me give you a really concrete example, because this makes a huge difference in the way in which police operate. For example, in Los Angeles, I don't have the exact dollar amount, the monetary details, but they have made a city council law saying that there won't be as much given toward the police department. And instead of having police come out for every call, they're now going to use social workers, sometimes trained social workers, to come they're going to respond to domestic calls, and, for example, to family arguments. And when you think about it, we don't need armed police departments coming out with guns. What you need instead is to have trained women and men who are experienced in knowing how to diffuse those kinds of situations. That's desirable. People have been talking about that for a long time, but I think it took the example of those mass protests in Los Angeles and in other places throughout the United States that finally served as the catalyst to make this kind of thing happen. Very, very important to have that happen. There are so many things where we don't need police officers with guns, with big sticks. There is probably a reason to have them, but much, much less than we've ever needed them in the past. So I think that that's a very positive development. And I'm hopeful that that trajectory, that development is going to continue. Another very important legal development is that cities and other legal authorities, the legislative bodies that run city governments, are going to much more closely regulate police departments. For a lot of years, police departments and individual police officers have unfortunately been able to do really whatever they want to do. And now with all of these protests, there's going to be a lot of greater scrutiny on what police are able to do. And one very major area, and this is absolutely crucial, is that the use of chokeholds is going to be outlawed. It's not now totally outlawed in all police departments. Think about what the United States is. We have 50 states and thousands of cities, many of which have individual police departments. But in so many of these places, these use of chokeholds, some of you, I think, probably know what that is. It's the chokehold that really killed George Floyd. It was the chokehold that back, I think, in 2014, killed Eric Garner in Staten Island, New York, where the police officer puts a hand or a club on the neck of somebody that he or she, usually he, is trying to arrest, and it cuts off the circulation, cuts off the breathing. And that has been much too often used against people of color, predominantly Black people, predominantly Mexican American people, and that's been much too often used. And those regulations have been, that's now been very much in the public scrutiny, and I think that's going to change. I'm going to be talking in a few moments about some national developments legally. We don't know whether those developments are going to go anywhere or not. I'm going to be discussing whether that may have some possibilities. There is a legislation that the new president, Joe Biden, has passed, has tried to get Congress to do. I don't know whether Congress is going to approve that or not, but the use of chokeholds now looks like it's on the way out, and that is a very good development. There's another area, and that's in the area of no-knock warrants. Now, in the United States, sometimes in order to enter a house, you have to have a warrant, and that is a legal document issued by a judge. But for a long time, police officers who had a warrant to enter a house could do it by just going into the house without knocking on the door. That was the reason that Breonna Taylor, who was not suspected of doing anything, her boyfriend was apparently suspected, and they came in and they shot her while she was in bed, and they just came in without knocking. So the new drive is to eliminate what's called no-knock warrants. I think that too is a particularly positive development, so that from now on, police officers who want to enter a home have to first knock and announce that it's the Louisville Police Department or the Cincinnati Police Department or the Seattle Police Department or the Los Angeles Police Department or any other police department before they actually barge into a home. That would itself probably have the impact of saving a lot of lives. And I have to say, probably saving a lot of lives of Black and brown people. There are other features of police practices that have recently changed as a direct result of the various mass protests that we have seen, and that, as I said, I was involved in Los Angeles. One of those, although this has been in process for a number of years, but I think it's intensified in the last several months, it's the use of body cameras. And that means that police officers, excuse me, have to wear a camera, which means that they have to record what they're doing. Those are not perfect, but they are absolutely better than nothing. It is, I believe, much better to have a record of what the police are doing than not having a record. And so what's been happening in certain cases, they've had the records, but the police departments have kept the records and have not disclosed them to the public. But at least having them makes it possible for lawyers and for criminal defendants to have access to know exactly what went on. As I said, they're not perfect, and sometimes the quality of the recordings are less than perfect. But in the world that we live in, a very imperfect world, it's probably better than nothing to have them. That's one thing. Probably a more important development, and this is something that has been written into local law especially, is the changes in recruitment and training of police officers. We're seeing that already in Los Angeles, where there have been very strong efforts to recruit more minority members to serve in police departments. And I think that's important, to actually have people from the communities to serve in police departments. Now, that, of course, is also not perfect, because there is a culture of policing that once people get in, they become part of the culture of a police department. And it's been often the case. I know, because I've spent so much of my life in Black communities. I've done a lot of research. I think Vera knows that in another part of my life, I'm also an art historian. I've written lots of books and articles about African-American visual art, and I've given lectures also at the Masaryk University and many other places on African-American visual art. And so I've spent a lot of time in the Black community, especially among Black artists. And regrettably, I know a lot of Black people, and they have had sometimes very unpleasant experiences with police officers, including with Black police officers, because sometimes Black police officers, not always, but sometimes Black police officers, in order to show that they're part of the police team, become even more violent than some of the white police officers. Not always, but that can be a problem. But it's still, in general, better to have people from the community than not to have them. Look, I've been in the civil rights movement for a long, long time. I have myself been billy clubbed 3 times in my life. It's not fun. I survived just fine. But the first time I ever got billy clubbed in Atlanta, Georgia, was by a Black police officer. So these things happen. And believe me, I have Black friends for whom this has also happened. So that's one thing, but it's still a good thing. Probably a more serious thing is that some of the local legislative developments have required different and more extensive training, and training is really important. Training is a very important aspect, that they are now going to make sure that the people who are hired as police officers are more fully trained to understand about the cultures of various minority communities, so that they, as part of their training, in addition to knowing all about law enforcement, also have to know about Black culture, Mexican American culture, Asian American culture. And so I think that area is going to be improved, and sexual harassment, and among other things. So I think those things are going to be legislatively mandated, and I think we're likely in the next few years to see some significant improvements on that level. One of the most important legal developments that we have seen is better hiring practices. And one of the most important things that we've seen in that area is that we're going to have some improvements on the limits of those who are fired from other jurisdictions. The most horrible example of that occurred in 2014. Some of you may know of the case of the 12-year-old boy, Tamir Rice, who was shot to death in Cleveland, Ohio, by a Cleveland, Ohio police officer. He was just 12 years old, and he was waving a toy gun, and the Cleveland police officer came out, and less than 2 seconds later, he took out his gun and shot Tamir Rice to death. That same police officer had been fired from another police department and hired almost immediately by the Cleveland Police Department. So now they're working on procedures to keep that from happening, so that there's some kind of a registry to keep police officers who've been fired for misconduct from being hired by other police departments. We have a long way, I think, to go for that, but we're making improvements on that level. So I think that's a very good thing. And that comes as a direct result of the 2020 anti-racist George Floyd protests. One final thing is that I think we're having now more civilian oversight. You cannot trust the police to investigate the police. You must have civilians investigating complaints about police misconduct. You must have independent investigators. You cannot trust the police to just do it themselves. And so we are now setting up in various jurisdictions independent civilian oversight committees. I have to check. I'm not quite sure exactly what the status is in Los Angeles, but that has been one of the major demands of the protests, and I think it's moving in that direction. Let me now shift to some of the focus to some of the national legal developments. Those are local issues, and that's important because in the United States, we have, as I said, 50 states and so many different municipalities, and so much of police life occurs at that level. And so many of the protests were local. I mean, I was on Los Angeles protests, but even in my community, I was on one in Long Beach, California, which is an independent city. I was on one in Santa Monica, which is an independent city, and they have independent police departments. And so what they decide affects their jurisdiction and not the other jurisdictions. And so they have independent city councils. And so what they decide affects their jurisdictions, but not the other. And it's interesting because where I live, in the city of Los Angeles, I'm 2 blocks away from Culver City and 3 blocks away from Santa Monica. Those are separate jurisdictions with separate police departments. And so what, excuse me, what my city council does doesn't affect what happens just a few blocks away. So all of these local issues are tremendously important in terms of contemporary legal development. So let me again shift the focus a little to the national scene. Above all, and some of you may know how I feel about this, and I will certainly not be shy about expressing that. We now have a new president of the United States of America. As of January 20th, 2021, our long, how do I put this? I can't be very, I have to be very blunt. Our long national nightmare with Donald Trump is finished. President Joe Biden has taken several steps to reverse Donald Trump's regressive, and I believe, I'm saying this very carefully here, have reversed his regressive, even fascistic policies. And I want to explain exactly what they mean and what the implications of those happen to be. The first thing that President Biden has done was to issue a number of what are known as executive orders. Those are not the same as legislation. They are not as strong and they are not as durable as legislation passed by Congress. They can be reversed by another president, just as Donald Trump issued many executive orders. The moment Joe Biden entered the White House, he reversed many of Donald Trump's executive orders. And the same thing could happen with another president. Nevertheless, they have the force of law. They are legally binding. They are one of the legal developments in the as a result of the 2020 George Floyd protests. I actually believe that the 2020 protests were a variable in the election of Joe Biden. They mobilized the black community. It mobilized them, and they voted in abundance. I'll have more to say about that a little later in this morning's presentation. But I would like now to take a look at some of the executive orders issued by the President of the United States. Vera, is there a problem? No, I see. I'm continuing.
No. I would like to.
Go ahead. No, I see. Should I continue?
I'm just going to ask the participants if they could, if they want to ask any questions, if they could write to int for international int@law.muni.cz, because I think there is a problem with using the chat. So if there are any questions, I ask the participants to write to int@law.muni.cz. So we can even answer any questions at the end of this presentation. Thank you.
I will leave time to answer questions.
Yes, it's not possible to actually write into a chat of this presentation. So if any participants have any questions, they can ask by email, and I'll read the questions so you can answer. Okay? Thank you. And I'm back to you.
Okay. So let me take a look at some of the executive orders that President Biden issued. Some of those were issued the very first day that he took office on January 20th this year. I will give you some of the most important ones. One of the first that he issued was to reverse the travel ban against travel from Muslim countries. That was when Donald Trump said no Muslims can come into the United States. I believe that was a horrifically racist kind of restriction, and the Supreme Court said it was okay, but President Biden said no, this will not stand, and so now that executive order is no longer operative, and we have a new order that says no, people from those countries are allowed to travel to the United States. Now, the problem, of course, is a different one, and that's COVID-19, but that's a different problem. That's not a racist problem. That's a pandemic problem. But that's very, very important, and President Biden had the legal authority to do that. Another very important one was that President Biden halted the construction of what I believe to be the absurd border wall, and he just stopped the construction. I also thought that was a terribly racist move, and I thought it was totally ridiculous. Some of you may remember it's a long time ago in 2016 when Donald Trump originally ran for president. He assured his supporters that Mexico was going to pay for that border wall. Now, that, of course, was totally a lie. Mexico, of course, never paid for the border wall. And in fact, not much of the border wall was actually built, but it was designed to show that Donald Trump hated Mexican and Honduran, Central American immigrants generally. And President Biden stopped that. That's another executive order that has the force of law. The other thing that he did was to reverse Donald Trump's plan to exclude non-citizens from the census. Under actually under the United States Constitution, the basic law of the land, we have to have a census. We have to have a total count of everybody in the United States every 10 years. And this is in 2020, they had to start the count. And Donald Trump said, we shall exclude all non-citizens. Now, that's tremendously significant politically because in states like California, where we have a large number of people not documented, but who live in this state. I know in Los Angeles, we have a huge number of people. There are at least 11 million people in the United States who are not properly documented, but they live here, and for years and years they were counted. That has a lot to do with who gets federal money and who gets proper representation in Congress. So President Biden has reversed that. One of the most important executive orders that President Biden has issued was he's phasing out, it's not quite done yet, is the existence of private prisons. I regard private prisons as just an example of American torture. We have this collection of private prisons not run by the government, but by private corporations for profit. And the overwhelming majority of people in these prisons are people of color, mostly African, people of African origin and people of Latino origin. And so that is changing. From my perspective, it needs to change immediately. So nothing is fast enough. But that is a very, very good development. And that, too, has the force of law. That's, I think, one of the most important things that he has done. He's also recently issued an executive order that is to mitigate racial bias in housing, also extremely important, so that people of color are able finally to purchase houses without discrimination. And that's also, I think, all of these are a direct reflection of the 2020 protests. There's some other executive actions that are also, I think, very positive and progressive developments. I hope that some other things are soon to come. One of them, which I'm looking for, and I hope is going to come soon, will be a moratorium, an end on the federal death penalty. I believe that putting people to death under the color of law is barbaric. I believe it's racist. In the last few weeks of the Trump administration, the federal government executed 13 people, including one woman who was so seriously mentally ill that it was heartbreaking to see her go to her death via lethal injection right before he left office. Biden, I know, is opposed to the death penalty, which has always been deeply racist. The rest of the civilized world has abolished it. You do not have the death penalty in Europe. And I regret to say that the United States joined such countries as China and Iran and Saudi Arabia and continuing to use that. I'm also happy to tell you that Virginia, the state of Virginia, to its credit, just recently, I think a week or two ago, abolished the death penalty, and California has just put it on hold. So let me look briefly at two of the legislative developments that are now in Congress. Legislative developments are more substantial. If they pass, they are much harder to reverse because they have the force of law in ways that really are far more durable. If you can get a legislative act passed, it means it's passed by the House of Representatives and then the Senate and then signed by the President of the United States. It is far more substantial and is not easily undone. It can be undone, but it is far harder to do that. So there are two legal developments that are not yet law, but they are, I believe, very promising. And these are direct results, really direct results of the massive protests that we have had for the last several months. I don't know what the chances are. It's not easy with, we have a Democratic president. I can tell you a little bit about the political realities. We have a Democratic House of Representatives and a very, very narrow Democratic Senate. It's 50-50. And under the American system of government, when it's an even split, the Vice President of the United States, in this case, Kamala Harris, gets to cast the deciding vote. Just a day or two ago, they passed the COVID relief bill 50-49. And they had to use a legal procedure called reconciliation. It's much too complicated for me to try to explain here. But they're not going to be able to use that procedure for the legislation that I'm about to describe for you now. So let me tell you what these are, and I will give you my sense of what their prospects are. And I have to tell you, be very optimistic about that. I hope I'm wrong, but I honestly don't believe I am. The first of those is actually called the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act of 2020. Let me explain that. It was obviously named after George Floyd. So clearly it's related to what happened, that horrible murder that all of us saw on video. This legislation seeks excuse me again, seeks to combat police misconduct, excessive force, and racial bias in policing. It's a very, very sweeping law. It's a comprehensive act. It addresses, it's a national law. Instead of, what I showed you earlier with these local laws, where Los Angeles does one thing, Rochester, New York does another, Kansas City, Missouri does another, and sometimes they're similar, sometimes they're different, sometimes they're stronger, sometimes they're weaker, sometimes they do a lot, sometimes they do a little, and in some places like Texas and Mississippi, very conservative states with very Republican governors and Republican councils, they do absolutely nothing. So it absolutely varies when we have all of these jurisdictions. Now, this act, the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act of 2020, this is going to be national legislation. And if it's passed by both chambers of Congress, the House of Representatives and the United States Senate, and it will be signed, if it gets that far, by President Joe Biden, that makes it a national law. And we have a constitution that has something, I've talked about that when I've taught at the Faculty of Law, something called the Supremacy Clause. And if there's a conflict between a local law and the federal law prevails. It's in the Constitution of the United States. Whenever there's a conflict between a local law and the United States Constitution or a federal law prevails. So if this passes, then it doesn't matter what the local law says. It's the federal standard that if it passes, that would work. Let me then explain what it would be. It would do so much. It would reform, and it would do so much more than reform. It would reduce, it would eliminate deadly force. Well, what it says specifically is that deadly force may only be used as a last resort. That means that police are absolutely constrained from using deadly force to shoot people unless they have no other option. That is their only resort to do it. And unfortunately, throughout American history, deadly force has not been the last resort. Sometimes, I'm sorry to say, it's been the first resort, and that's pretty horrible. So if this law gets passed, it must be the last resort. And if it's not the last resort, there are sanctions that the government can bring. It's a long and overdue law. So what will happen? The House of Representatives has already passed it. Trump is no longer an obstacle. Trump made very clear that he was never going to sign that. Of course, Trump wasn't going to sign that. He loved to say that he was in favor of the police, except, of course, his supporters were not in favor of the police when they tried an insurrection on January 6th. It's another issue. But most of the Republican senators are not in favor of this. And under the filibuster rules, in order to pass a legislation in the Senate, you have to have 60 votes. So the issue is there any possibility? There are two things you can do. You can either eliminate the filibuster. I don't think that's going to happen. I know a lot of progressive Democrats want to eliminate the filibuster. I would like to see the Democrats eliminate the filibuster, but I don't think that that's going to happen. So I don't believe it's going to happen. So secondly, Is it possible that with this law you can get 10 Republican votes? Frankly, I doubt it. I just doubt it. There is one black Republican senator named Tim Scott. He seems to care about these issues. He's black, he understands it. It's possible that he can bring a few of his Republican colleagues on board. Maybe yes, maybe no. Can he bring 10? I doubt it. So I'm sorry to say, I do not regard this as a strong possibility. I so wish that I were wrong. I really wish I were wrong. I do not believe that I am wrong, but only time, as they say, will tell. We'll see. It's a long and overdue law. I hope Congress passes it. I don't think it will. The second major law is called the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. This is also extremely important legislation, and it essentially seeks to remedy a very, very bad decision made by the United States Supreme Court in 2013 called Shelby County versus Holder. I actually taught that. I teach that in my class in racism law, and I actually taught that last time I was teaching racism law at Massachusetts University. It was in my book. I taught it. We spent a little bit of time in it when I was in class with the students here. And what happened in 2013 was that the United States Supreme Court essentially said that the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was largely unconstitutional. Then the late and great Congressman John Lewis said that it took a dagger to the heart of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and he was so right. That was one of the biggest accomplishments of the 1960s civil rights movement, and I remember it so well when President Lyndon Johnson, signed it into law with a great deal of Republican support, by the way. Congressman John Lewis, who died, I think earlier this year, was one of the great civil rights. Yesterday, your time, it was the anniversary of Bloody Sunday, when the police just beat up the marchers at the Edmund Pettus Bridge. It was my great good fortune to know John Lewis for more than 50 years. I worked with John Lewis in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. I knew him on and off for a long time. We got together. I was on the same sit-in with him in the early 1960s. And his death was a great loss to the United States. And that's why they named this bill after him. It was, I would love to see that law pass. He was a relentless advocate for voting rights. And unfortunately, what we see today is a lot of Republicans trying to stop voting rights. That's a very frightening development. This law, if it passes, would stop all of that, but I don't think it's going to pass. It would stop restrictive voting rights. This is what's happening right now. I think Republicans are very upset that so many black and brown voters voted. And so in states like Georgia and Arizona, they're trying to pass very restrictive legislation. We desperately need it. Because so many states like Georgia and Arizona are rushing to deny voters the vote. You know, they claim that there was voter fraud. We had the freest and fairest election ever. There was no fraud. in the election that we had in November of 2020. And now they're rushing to deny voters the right to have mail-in ballots. They're rushing to deny voters the right to vote on Sundays, especially Black voters in Georgia who go to church on Sunday and they turn out in large numbers called souls to the polls. And they're even in Georgia trying to make it a criminal offense. This is true. So that anybody who brings them water or food as they wait in long lines to vote, to bring them water or food will be made a criminal offense. That is outrageous. But this law would put an end to all of that. President Biden has just issued another executive order just yesterday saying that he's going to try to stop as much of this as possible. He certainly wants to approve such legislation, but Trump certainly said no, he would never approve that because Trump was a racist. I don't believe that this law can get through Congress. I just don't believe that you'll get the votes in the United States Senate to do it. That is, to me, totally tragic. The essence of a democracy is the ability to vote in a democratic election. And what's happening now is that the Republican Party, since it cannot gain enough votes fairly and squarely, wants to just keep people from voting at all. So we'll see. These are wonderful acts, but I think, unfortunately, they're not going to get anywhere because they're going to be blocked in the United States Senate. So those are what's happening. But I must tell you, and I think that many of you may be interested, so I want to spend a few moments before we have questions. There's one final thing that I really would like to consider. It's a little beyond the topic, but it's obviously very interesting, and it's something that I'm following very closely. There is the issue of Donald Trump himself. There are some legal developments that may be happening, and we should really consider what might happen. We don't know for sure, but I'm following this very, very carefully, and I would like to just alert you to what you may be following in the next several months. Even though the former president of the United States quite delusionally believes that the election he lost was actually fraudulent, it was not. He is actually in serious legal trouble. And I'd like to just spend a moment or two. I would like to conclude my presentation by giving you some observations about what the former president of the United States is actually potentially facing. So let me just kind of outline some of that for you. That is really one of the legal developments in the post-George Floyd era. He's no longer the president, which means this: he no longer has presidential immunity. When he was president of the United States, he could not face criminal prosecution. There was a rule in the Department of Justice saying that no sitting president could be charged criminally. There were a lot of lawyers, including me, who didn't believe that that rule made a lot of sense. But that was the rule, and that was the way it was interpreted. So that's just the way it was. But as of January 20th, that's no longer operative for Donald Trump. So he no longer has presidential immunity. So as a former president, any former president can now face criminal charges. And that's not unusual. It's certainly not unusual. Look, right now in France, Former President Sarkozy in France has just been convicted and is facing a year in prison. He's not going to actually go to a penitentiary. He's probably going to do his time at home. And in Israel, Prime Minister Netanyahu is facing criminal charges, so it's not out of the question. So let me give you what I think Donald Trump is facing. There are a couple of different areas. In New York City, he is facing charges, possible criminal charges of tax fraud. The local prosecutor, Cyrus Vance, the district attorney, Supreme Court just a few weeks ago gave him more than a million pages of Donald Trump's tax returns. Donald Trump for years said that he was going to make them public. That was another one of his many lies. He was never going to give the public his tax returns, and the public, in fact, is never going to see those tax returns. But the prosecutor in New York City now has them, and he's hired a very experienced racketeering prosecutor to assist him with that. It is entirely possible, I don't know for sure, but it is entirely possible that Donald Trump may face a criminal charge of tax fraud in New York City, which could possibly result in an indictment and a substantial prison sentence. The second major area with criminal liability is in the state of Georgia. Several weeks after the election and before the inauguration of President Biden, and before the Congress certified the Electoral College results, Donald Trump made a phone call to the Secretary of State of Georgia, the official who was to certify the Georgia election results. It was an infamous phone call, and he demanded that the Secretary of State in Georgia find 11,780 votes. Basically, Donald Trump tried to intimidate the Georgia official to find votes for Donald Trump that didn't exist. That's election fraud. And there is a newly elected young African-American woman prosecutor in Georgia. And I think she is very good at what she does. We don't know what's going to happen, but this month she is impaneling a grand jury, and the grand jury in Atlanta has the power to issue an indictment. And if that's the case, Donald Trump could then face another criminal trial in the state of Georgia. And I might add that if he were to go on trial in Georgia, a jury in Atlanta would be composed predominantly of Black citizens, because Atlanta, Georgia is a predominantly Black city. And one has to kind of be aware that Black citizens in Atlanta are not exactly favorable to Donald Trump. So that's another possibility. There's a third possibility. In the District of Columbia, Washington, D.C., there's a district attorney who is now investigating possible charges of instigating the anti-democratic insurrection on January 6th. Now, I think it's an easy case, but I'm biased. Of course, I'm biased. I saw with horror what happened in the United States Congress on January 6th. That was an attempted insurrection by some 700 or 800 fascistic lunatics who tried to take over the United States Congress, and it was very dangerous. I also saw Donald Trump's speech that morning. I have no doubt that he was instigating that crowd, and that he had every intention of having those people go to the Capitol and actually take them over. But that would be a matter of fact for a jury to decide. So it's possible that an indictment in the city of Washington, D.C. Could come down. That's independent of the federal government. That's a District of Columbia matter, although it's overseen by the Federal Department of Justice. And that would also not be a sympathetic jury, because Washington, D.C. is also a predominantly black city. And finally, there are potential federal criminal charges, but that is much more problematic because we don't yet have a confirmed federal attorney general. President Biden's appointment of the sitting judge, Merrick Garland, has not yet been confirmed by the United States Senate. That will be confirmed, and maybe this week or the week after. But I don't think that the new attorney general is likely to want to go after a former president of the United States. That's my bet on the matter. I'm pretty confident about that judgment. I doubt that President Biden is particularly interested in seeing the federal government go with criminal charges against the former president. So that's the way I see it. But there's one other area where Donald Trump may be liable, and that's the area of civil liability. We know that for years and years, the New York State Attorney General has been looking at his really convoluted tax cases. Her name is Letitia James, and she is dealing with many years of his tax returns as well. And that's a civil, not a criminal case, but that could cost Donald Trump millions and millions and millions of dollars of money, and he cares a great deal about his money. I think more than anything else. So we have no idea where that's going to go, but she's a pretty relentless prosecutor, so I'm pretty confident that she's going to do something with it. There's one final area. There are some defamation cases that are currently pending. There are a number of women who have accused Donald Trump of sexual assault, and those cases are now pending, and we shall see where those go. I mean, we have lots of allegations that he was guilty of a variety of cases of sexual misconduct, and he defamed those women in public when he used to have a Twitter account. And these women have sued him. And for a long time, the Department of Justice, under the former Attorney General, really served essentially as his private attorney, and that's now finished. So we shall see what happens with those cases. Whatever it looks like, he's going to face court battles for years to come. I hope that that's the case, frankly. I believe that it's likely that that's going to keep him away from the political ground, from the political battleground. I believe as well, this is my personal bias, of course, that the United States and the world has had more than enough of Donald Trump. Look, this is a small sample of the post 2020 developments there's so much more. When I do my actual class, I'm going to get into it in detail because I have 10 weeks to do it, but I didn't have that kind of time with you. I really hope so very much to see you all in person in hopefully even as early as this coming autumn. Until then, all my very best. I really, please stay well as soon as you can. Try to get vaccinated as soon as you can, whatever you can, whether it's Pfizer, whether it's Moderna, whether it's Johnson and Johnson. Your health is your absolute first priority. It's so very important. Thank you all very, very much. I really appreciate this opportunity. I'm delighted to take any questions you would like to ask.
Okay, thank you, Paul. It was well spoken. It was really informative, insightful, very personal, almost like very honest. The presentation is obviously so inspirational for whoever was listening. There are some questions coming through. Perhaps I can read one of them.
Yes.
So to what extent are the incarceration rates for African American men and women affected by the president of the US? For example, if we compare President Obama and President Trump, for instance, what were the rates? What were the reasons for them to be as they were?
The president has a lot to do with how minority groups are affected. It's really interesting. I actually think Biden is going to be better for the minority communities than Obama. And here's the reason why. And certainly anybody would be better than Trump because Trump was clearly a racist. Here's the problem with Obama. Because he was black, he was a little reluctant to be out in front on issues of racial justice. Sometimes he was, but then he had to pull back a little bit. But Biden, because he's white, doesn't have to be that reluctant to do it. I think actually Biden is one of the best people in civil rights we're likely to see. Now it's early. I mean, Biden has only been he's only been president since January 20th, so it's too early to really know. But I don't really think that Obama's record on civil rights was as good as many of us had hoped. He was not very good on immigration. He deported far too many people. He did not do very good work on prisons. We have to say he was certainly better. I mean, anybody would have been better than Trump, but Obama was a kind of mainstream centrist liberal who, in the progressive community, turned out to be a little disappointing. The president can have huge power. And so far, I think that Joe Biden has gotten off to a very, very promising start. That's why I read some of those executive orders and some of the things that he's tried so far to introduce. But again, it's very early. It's political. It's all so very political. But that's what lawyers have to be political. At least civil rights lawyers like me.
Thanks, Paul. And what about the question which concerns basically women and girls of color? Talking about equity for women and girls of color, there were some programs introduced some 6 or 7 years ago. Can you see any remarkable outcome? What is the situation now, and what do you think is going to be done in the area in the future?
For women?
For women, yeah, this time for women and girls of color.
I think we have a lot of work to do for that. This is a good time to ask that question because March is, at least in the United States, it's Women's History Month. And I think that the combination of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris seem to have, excuse me, a very good progressive vision about all of that. One of the very good things that I saw on the protests was that there was a huge number of women on those protests, and they are very, very committed to making sure that there is gender equality. My students know that I am a deeply committed feminist. I have made that a top priority of everything that I've ever done as a teacher for more than 50 years. That gender equality is as intricately related to racial equality. Gender justice must go hand in hand with racial justice. The two cannot be separated. And I'm cautiously optimistic that we're going to make significant progress on that front. And I have to say that there have been some horrible, horrible examples of gender discrimination. In one of the private prisons, for example, there was forced sterilization of some of the women inmates. It was just horrible, and that's one of the reasons we have to put an end to these private prisons. I think some of the African inmates and some of the Central American inmates were taken out. They were supposed to be given routine gynecological exams, and they were actually sterilized. It was scandalous. And this must stop. That's just an extreme example of the kind of thing that has to end. We've had in my own university, there's a gynecologist who's been arrested for doing just horrible things to women patients, and across the town at the University of Southern California, the same thing. One of my own students was victimized by him. And these conditions never end. I have a personal experience as a lawyer in sexual harassment cases. Again, pro bono. I've done that, so it's part of my general overall fight on every level you can fight for as long as you can fight for as long as you live. It's really important. I'm glad that she asked. I assume it's a she who's asked that question. Are there others?
Yeah, there's one more basically generally about what is going to happen worldwide. With obviously, will it reignite more worldwide movement? This George Floyd's case and the judging afterwards. Do you think it will influence the whole worldwide situation?
I hope so. We're going to see this next week. These next few weeks will be very interesting. It depends on what's going to happen in the trial of the police officer, Derek Chauvin. If he's not found guilty, I think there will be massive demonstrations once again in Minneapolis and perhaps throughout the country and maybe even throughout the world. I want this energy to continue. I want it to continue throughout the world. The only thing that changes things will be people. Change comes from the bottom up. It doesn't, I think it's really important to elect leaders, but the real energy comes from people on the ground level. It's people at the bottom. It's people on the street that make things happen. I'm biased. I've been on the streets. I've never held political office. I like being on the streets. I like when people mobilize and try to change the course and direction of their own lives. I won people all over the world. And we're seeing it. We're seeing it in Hong Kong. We're seeing it in Burma. People are moving. I mean, and we're seeing it in Russia. We're seeing it in Belarus. Now there's a price. I mean, people unfortunately get killed. But that's the only way that people change things. It's when people move and they change things. You know, of course, in Belarus and Burma, they get killed. A few people get killed in the United States, but not as many. But it's worse in other countries. Look, my students know me. I was in Czechoslovakia in 1968 and 69. I saw what happened when the Russians marched in. It's the only time in my life I saw somebody shot by the Red Army. I was younger then. I love telling my students that I was once younger. My students don't believe me, but I was. People have to keep mobilizing. It's a better way to live a life. I'm happy to answer any others. If not,
Yeah, I'm going to remind the participants that, you know, even, I mean, they had to process so much information. You know, you've made the presentation really full of motivating and inspirational thoughts, and you know, full of facts and also emotions. So I'm sure, you know, they have to process it now. So if they want to still write even later, ask any questions,
they can.
They should not hesitate to do so. I repeat, the email for us in the international office is int@law.muni.cz. So I will be very happy to forward any questions to you, which, you know, in your time, at your convenience, can answer. I know it's been a long day for you, late night.
Right.
For us, it's morning here, but obviously.
Yeah, the rest of the day.
Okay, so you know, we'll watch the news. We will obviously, we know it's happening now. The case, the jury and everything it's happening now, which means it will be something to really watch. And any updates from you, any, you know, more insightful information will be obviously appreciated. I will be very happy to share anything with the students, with our members of staff. Okay.
Terrific.
Paul, thanks so much.
So good to see you. It really is. I'm sorry for the technical difficulties the other day, but we figured it out. We did it. We did it. Okay, have a great day, and we will be in touch. I hope that your COVID situation gets better and that I will be able to come back and see you. I really do want that to happen. Of course, I want that. Both of us want to come back and see you. We like being in Brno. We
can't wait, Paul. We wait. We want to have you back, and we look forward to having you back when, you know, better times come.
Well, better times will come. I'm going to work with the Department of English and American Studies and work it out with them as well, and you know, run back and forth, and I can do that. I love doing that, and I have good friends there too.
Okay. Again, thank you so much for the presentation. Thank you for your time and all the efforts. Thank you.
Have a wonderful day, and we shall be in touch.
Bye.
Have a good day, and I will try to get some sleep. Okay.
Please do. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.